Welcome to everyone joining for this, the penultimate of our webinar series, Do It Right or Do It Fast. We have the project managers out today. We'll be underway with them shortly. Coming up, the season finale. David Thomas, his webinar, The Genies Have Left the Bottle, taking a look at some big trends he thinks will change us forever, and what does the post-COVID landscape look like. That's at 2 o'clock tomorrow, so join us for that. It's been a fun 4 weeks. I can't say that I'm not looking forward to a break, but if you haven't registered for that, it's good. We had a run through today of it earlier on. Well worth a look. But we'll be underway with our project managers just after 2 o'clock. Okay, so it's just after 2 o'clock here, UK time, so I think we'll make a start. I can still see a few people joining, but we will crack on, as all projects like to stay on time. Do It Right or Do It Fast is the title of this one. It's a working title we had as an idea, and then we had some great contributions from various people from different areas of project management, and so we're delighted to have Tony Barnes, Director of Operations for Tessitura Network, Darren Poynter, UK Account Manager for Yesplan, and Elisa Damiani from Substrakt, giving 3 different bits of detail. If you haven't been on one of these before, pretty simple format. We're going to be at 45 to 60 minutes, depending on how we get on with Q&A. We are recording, so you have to nip away, kids, dogs, cats, anything else. You can get the session later on YouTube and on the website. Format today is a little bit different. We've got 3 different presentations. So we're going to have a presentation from Tony coming up about project principles. Darren's going to talk about working remote and some of the stuff he's been doing, working on projects for Yesplan with clients around Europe. And then finally, the top 10 tips to succeed with Eliza to finish off. Then into open Q&A. If you haven't used Zoom Q&A before, at the top or your bottom of your screen, you'll find a toolbar. In there is a button marked Q&A, and then you can pop your question in there. Also, you can give a thumbs up or comment on other questions if you do want to put, give them a thumbs up to get higher up the list. And we've turned on the anonymous feature here because sometimes people like to ask a question without putting their head above the parapet. So if you want to ask a question in anonymous mode, you can do that too. So without further ado, and the power of technology, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Tony Barnes from the Tessitura Network. Tony.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen.
We can indeed.
Excellent. It's good when things work, isn't it? So I'm Tony Barnes. I'm the Director of Operations for Tessitura Europe. I've been with the Tessitura Network now for almost 14 years. And prior to that was the Sales and Systems Manager at Bridgewater Hall in Manchester for just over 12 years. So I'm going to be talking this afternoon about projects in the context of implementations, but certainly the principles could be applied across many types of projects. So implement fast versus implement well. I'm not necessarily sure it's a binary choice. I think it is possible to implement both fast and well, but I guess a factor in deciding whether that is possible depends on how you define fast and well. I'd say successful implementation is one that comes in on time, which could mean fast, on budget, and in scope. And I'm going to be starting by talking about the the constraints of these three variables place on an implementation, and then go through a very high level overview of what constitutes for us a successful implementation. So, unfortunately, in project management, it's usually not possible to get everything we want in exactly the time frame we want and within the budget we want. So within these three constraints, there must be some give and take. Not all the points on the triangle can be fixed, and at least one of them needs to be movable in order to accommodate the constraints of the other 2 points. I think it's worth pointing out here that the graphic there is showing costs. I've kind of expanded costs out to include budget and resources, so money available, which may include people to work on the project, constitute what I'm defining as costs. Time and scope, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. So the constraints on your particular project help inform the project management activities that will be critical to the overall success of your project. So, for example, if your timeline is constrained and your project must be finished quickly or by a particular milestone, then monitoring and tracking project schedules should be a top priority, and perhaps budget or cost management becomes less of a priority. Conversely, if you have a limited budget, then you might flip that and make sure that you and your project team are paying special attention to budget, but the timescale of the project is less important to you. Once you have these priorities established, you can then determine which project activities are needed for your particular project. So, consumers are becoming more accustomed to instant access to products or immediate delivery of services. Evidence of this fast mentality is the birth of terms such as quick start, fast track and express across project delivery. Market demand is leading vendors to produce ways to accelerate the delivery of their services. The danger of this with respect to implementations is that it can lead to organizations focusing on the fast approach without considering its implications with respect to the other constraints. This can lead to disappointment with the outcome, resulting in further time and money being spent in needing to revisit, reconfigure, and re-implement in order to get the desired outcome. As the old saying goes, do it once, do it right. And in order to do it right first time, all three constraints, time, resources, and scope, needs to be considered when planning. It's a fact software implementations sometimes don't meet their targets. They go over budget, there's no cross-departmental buy-in, go-live deadlines slip, and many other things. When an organization makes an investment in a new software platform, it's in their best interest to ensure that the implementation is robust and efficient, and they can quantify and demonstrate the return on the investment. So, what are the key factors to consider when aiming for a successful implementation? So these are the broad brushstroke phases of an implementation. These are the doing things. The things that need to be managed whilst doing the doing things are budget tracking, communication timeline, requirements or scope, multiple resources and dependencies. As you know, dependency is what tasks need to be completed before another one can begin, as well as reporting. That is providing regular updates to stakeholders, including formal executive level updates. A large project as an implementation certainly needs a formal kickoff meeting, the outcome of which should include defining timelines, budget, resources, and requirements, those 3 points of the project management triangle. There are some standard documents that are often used to record this information, usually referred to as the project definition document or the project charter, etc. These documents should be formally signed off when it's complete. This is especially helpful when you have a large number of stakeholders and project team members, as it will be the guiding star on the overall approach for the implementation and for the organisation, and will be based on the triple constraints of that project management triangle. Some of the things that the kickoff usually includes are definitions of success criteria. It sounds obvious, but having well-defined, measurable success criteria is a huge help in large projects. It not only generates agreement on scope at the beginning of the project, but gives you something to steer the ship towards as you go. When questions arise, it can be useful to consult your success criteria and ask which options get me to where I need to go. Kickoff can also include definitions of assumptions and constraints. Assumptions are circumstances and events that need to occur for the project to be successful, and by definition are assumed to be in place. But sometimes they may also be outside the total control of the project team. Constraints are more commonly based on resource and time and can really help define a project's trajectory. And time should also certainly be spent at kickoff considering the risks. Key criteria in considering risk are the likelihood of the event occurring and the severity of the consequences of the event occurring. These two factors will help inform what mitigation needs to be put in place to deal with should the risk arise or the event occur. A couple more tools for a large project are the communication plan, as discussed earlier, and a formal definition of roles and responsibilities. One nice way to do this is using the RACI matrix. For each grouping of tasks, it allows you to note who on your project team is responsible and accountable for the tasks, and who needs to be consulted or informed of the tasks as the project moves along. Like assumptions, this removes misunderstanding and allows for greater clarity of roles. When discussing tools, a project plan is a must. With a large project, it's probably worthwhile to use a true project planning tool rather than just Excel, if you have one available. These have many benefits, but not least is the ability to produce a beautiful Gantt chart. Who doesn't like a Gantt chart? Which allows you to visualize and manage the project dependencies. So the last tool I'd recommend for a large project is a retrospective. Retro is a chance to look back and assess. They should certainly always be done at the end of a large project, but they can also be useful at significant milestones during the project. They can take many forms. I've listed some of the most common ones here, but typically and generally they're in the format of a series of questions like here, and the answers to those questions can provide insight and an opportunity to learn from the team's experiences, both after the project, but as I said, certainly during the project as it moves along as well. So in summary, what are the things that define best practices for a good implementation? So with every project, you need to start by defining success, both internally to your teams and as well to the wider organisation. And when defining success, you need to be crystal clear on what's in scope and what's out of scope for this particular project. This shared vision, and it needs to be a shared vision of success, will serve to keep everyone on track. It means you need to identify your North Star, the point you keep in sight throughout an implementation in order to evaluate scope, timelines, and dependencies as you move through the implementation. When establishing a list of requirements, you should ask the question, what's the specific requirement that we need that will make us successful, and make sure that you build your implementation plan to meet those requirements. Gather your objectives across the business units and then use this input to build out your full requirements. The planning phase is really about articulating and distinguishing between project objectives and business goals. Project objectives are specifically related to the management of the implementation, whereas the business goals are what your business hopes to achieve as a result of the implementation. It goes without saying that the project objectives should tie in with the business objectives. A successful implementation needs to be viewed as a joint project across departments, but within one team, and within that team there needs to be clarity around individual roles. Delineate what is a responsibility of your internal team and what should be the responsibility of your software partner. The clearer the roles, the faster you can identify key resources that may come to be required as the project moves forward. Any implementation is too big for one person. Distribute the decision making. Senior leadership should be clear from the beginning in giving the autonomy necessary to empower their teams to get the implementation done. And buy-in can't just come from the people who evaluate a solution, but from the people who will use it. Actual users need to see a solution that will be an enabling platform for them and have the opportunity to give feedback in the early stages and throughout the implementation. With a cross-departmental team working on implementation projects, good communication goes without saying is vital, particularly so with an aggressive timeline. Quick feedback and direct communications are absolutely critical for success. And as a precursor, you need to work on communicating intentionally and to set up a strategy for communication with measures in place to ensure that everybody's communicating well. With respect to resource, early intent is important. It's important to identify critical dependencies and resources from the get-go, and then make sure that these resources are available and will be for the duration of the implementation. In order to stick to your timeline, it's critical to have the commitment of these resources when required during the phase of the implementation. Project governance, that includes identifying decision makers, having a timeline calendar for the core team with set dates, and then having sign off on key deliverables and milestones and defined and visible points of escalation. This governance should serve as your guide with signposts along the way. Once one box is checked, the team can agree it's done and move on to something else. This requires discipline from both sides of the implementation process. As discussed earlier, any implementation is a balance between scope, timeline, and resource, and the relative importance of each of these may change during the course of an implementation. So constant re-evaluation and prioritizing is important in order to maintain a clear path to the end goal. The final point, one team, build trust, is very easy to write down, but sometimes can be difficult to establish, but it is vitally important during the course of any implementation that there is trust within the project team and with the project team throughout the rest of the organization. And thank you very much for listening, and I will now pass over to Darren.
There we go. Thank you very much, Tony. As Andrew mentioned earlier, I'm Darren Poynter. I'm the UK account manager for Yesplan. I should explain that at the moment I too am currently furloughed at the moment, but so I'm joining this session just to talk about my experiences from my career so far. And talking of which, my career has been, well, I started off at the Theatre Royal here in Norwich, which is where I'm based. So I started, as a lot of people do, in the box office team, but then progressed into membership and ended up as marketing manager. From there, on to Audience View, again based from home, still in Norwich, but travelling around the country and the world, in actual fact, as a business analyst and deployment engineer. So lots of training of the new system. Going through all those processes. I also started my own company, Dazzle Solutions, which is offering technical solutions to various clients and some online branding. That's something that is still carrying on. And at the moment, as I say, I've been with Yesplan for just over 2.5 years as the account management. So I'm going to be running through some of the things in my experience, as I mentioned. It's not everything, it's not the be all and end all of a project, but some basic kind of reminders about things that most of us already know, or maybe think we know, but it's always a good idea to remind ourselves about those, and hopefully there'll be a few ideas that you can take away and use. So it's very much about being a client experience and as well as a supplier also. I found the biggest thing when managing a project and dealing with a project, the most important thing is building a relationship. So who are you talking to before you start any of the training? From both sides of the coin, you can both gain confidence of each other, and that will really embed that process for you and make life easier for you in the long run. So things like sharing experiences. What kind of events do you like to go to? You know, what's it like in that town or that city? Get to talk about them, and as a project manager from a supplier point of view, offer that information as well. So there's a bit of non kind of project information flowing between you. Things to ask that project management or all the clients is there anybody on either side that's new to the industry? That happens quite a lot where people come into it. And if that happens, sometimes terminology in our industry can be a big factor. So what something is called in one system is probably most likely going to be called something different in another system. So taking the time out just to understand those differences and not being frightened about asking what they mean and what they are. That's really helped me through the projects that I've done. Maybe there's some kind of reverse psychology things that say it's not a problem, it's nobody's fault. But from a supplier's point of view, and it's not a complaint either, but some of the project managers or the trainers that you come across has most likely done that same project many times over, and in some cases several times in the same day. So it's not an excuse, but that can have an impact on how a project runs. So maybe challenge that a little bit. A good example of that being from a client's point of view in my aspect is that I had a situation where the project was kind of flatlining somewhat, shall we say. So as the project management on the client side, we kind of got together and we paused the project, and actually we didn't stop it, we just paused it. And we talked to the supplier about other things outside that project. We even invited the supplier to come in on site if that hadn't happened already. We looked around, meet the team, went out for drinks and social things, that kind of thing. We even went 10-pin bowling on one example. And when we regrouped and restarted the project, there was such a change in attitudes between both my team at that point and the team of the supplier, that we actually ended up finishing the project way ahead of schedule and actually managed to get more things covered before our go live. So just, it's not all about the dotting the I's and crossing the T's in the project. It's that building that relationship will really help that process, as I mentioned. So take time for yourselves to make people understand where you're coming from. The supplier, they're there to lead you there where you want to be. It's up to the supplier to lead you through that and make sure that you understand parts of their system. And remember that they want you to be successful. They could be looking at you for recommendations for potential clients. That's quite a common thing. So just be aware of that and challenge those questions that you want. Don't be frightened about sharing experience. This happens quite a bit. What went well in the previous system or the current system? What didn't go so well? And what you're keen to avoid when you go into your next project. Make a list of those things. And make sure they're answered or prioritize them as you go through that process. And also remember that that project manager or that trainer of the supplier who you're speaking to, that might be the go-to person, but also remember they have a whole team behind them of technical people and other people, other managers and resources. They're not just the person, they are the voice of the company or the supplier, but they're not the only person. And lots of times I've seen that where people have been kind of frightened to talk about what they're missing or what's going wrong or anything, that get those things up front. So your training or project manager can take those away, give those things to maybe other parts of their team members that they can be working on behind the scenes, whilst the rest of the project continues. Again, what I've seen before is that actually these things come out at the last minute. So that then puts the whole project in jeopardy. It extends any go live dates you have and those kind of things. So just be aware of those as well. So to reiterate that, don't be afraid to ask if it's your project at the end of the day. So this is coming very much from the client side of things. The project is going to do everything they can to help you through that project. If they're good enough, will pick up on your strengths and weaknesses, and they should probably adapt their problems. But a lovely little slide I found a couple of days ago that I'm your project manager and I solve the problems you don't know in ways you can't understand, why you don't understand them, that you should be able to understand them and feel absolutely confident in moving those forwards. But also don't run before you can walk. When you go through the initial stages of a project, you're learning the basics and enough really in a lot of cases to get you live. It's when you go live, that's when you really start learning about that system or that profile. So just take that time out and don't put pressure on yourselves unnecessarily. You'll find, in my experience, I found that things go a lot smoother when that pressure is taken away. And a little bit about actually, which I'll talk about in a second, also about training sessions that you have. The amount of, it's maybe a funny thing, but the amount of times that people don't ask for this, but it makes a massive difference through the project, and that's asking for comfort breaks. I've seen so many times where I suggested to have a comfort break and see the relief on people's faces, whether I'm in the room or whether it's on a Zoom meeting with webcams working. The relief on people's faces, and then when they regroup again, the whole atmosphere changes and you can move on. So a little bit of a funny thing, but it's very important. And this is really this one about being a project manager and making them smile. So there is an onus on clients as well, I think, and this is more of a reminder. It's not a criticism, but it does cause some frustrations. So when you're using video calls where you can't go on site, make sure that you've got that webcam working and the microphone and any TVs or screens that you've got up and running. Yesplan, in actual fact, to bring to point, were supplying equipment before all this furlough working from home started much, the number of people who couldn't use a Zoom meeting or didn't have it installed, that's a little bit better now, obviously. But we were actually supplying equipment to the customers so that they could use those things, and we could see them and they could see us. And again, that changed the relationship between those things. So I could read, for example, I could see on the screen that someone wasn't understanding something. To go through, and if I saw that, then I could change the way I was explaining things, that kind of process. But a really big thing is about the IT setup time, and that can make a massive difference. The amount of times that we say that we're going to start at 10 a.m. And then we sit around for 15-20 minutes while we wait for that IT side of things to be set up. So what I've tried to instigate fairly recently is actually saying, okay, if somebody wants to start at 10 o'clock and for an hour for a training session, not too much over that time, otherwise people get distracted, but don't start it at 10 o'clock, set it 15 minutes later, build that time in so that you can set those things up and have them ready. So when you start at 10:15 and you can run for that full hour or however long that session is, book that meeting room for that extra 15 minutes. That 15-20 minutes where you're trying to set that up, if that's the time of the start of the meeting, then people get a little bit frustrated. I can see them getting switched off, and then it takes another 5 or 10 minutes for them to get re-engaged in the meeting that you're holding. And at that point, you've only got 15-20 minutes left of actual training time, because you have to move on and the room is only booked for an hour. So taking that 15 minutes out is a request from a project manager, if you like, but it really does help all those frustrations and take that away. And a really, really important thing as well is to have fun through the project. There's a lot of pressure on a lot of people, but making that fun. It could be, I've done things where I've just picked topics within the applications and made little quizzes out of them for people who can take away, and they can do them at home or out of the office or anything like that. But just have some fun with it. It's putting that fun element rather than kind of grey and dreary things. It's not. It should be fun. You should enjoy it. This is your project. This is why we came into this industry as well. And enjoy that success when you finished it. Take time out to celebrate. It is a big deal for everybody, both clients and the supplier. So I hope that's given it a little bit of insight about kind of how I approach things. Obviously, it's not everything to do with the project, as I mentioned, but yeah, hopefully that's of help. And any questions, please feel free to ask. But for now, for that, I'm going to hand over to Eliza.
Thank you, Darren. Hi all, I am Elisa. I am the head of project delivery for Substrakt. We make websites for arts organizations. Before that, I worked at Spectrix for 2 years as a senior project manager. And before that, I was in Spectrix Spain doing projects too. And in Spain, I worked at several organizations, working always implementing projects. So today, I am going to be talking about tips from a project manager for non-project managers, and is how to run a project successfully and survive it. So most of the times when we start a project in a new arts organization we're working with, we do realize that, like for most people we're working with, that project is another project on top of the day-to-day work. And sometimes, most of the times, the workload of the person that is managing the project at the end of the organization is already quite big. So you find yourself that you have a new project to do and you don't have the time. You really want to give it your best and you want to really succeed on the project. So this presentation today hopefully will help you with some tips on achieving that. The first thing is communication. I think both Tony and Darren have already spoken about it, but this is fundamental. And when we speak about communication, we not only speak about communication with the vendor PM, which is fundamental. Like, I love having communication, open communication with all the clients that we work with. And it can be as easy as like 15 minutes catch up with that person. So just to make sure that like everything is still going as it was planned, but also it is about the internal communication. And why is that important? Because you need to let the team, your team, know that like you are working on the project, what is that is happening in the project. This is not only important so you can communicate what you're doing, but also for people to understand more about the project. Because a lot of people, sometimes I find that when we are doing a new website for an organization, we just come in and like maybe only one department is aware of like all the work that is going in the website project. In Substrakt, we do something like very interesting, which is like every week we send like weekly headlines on Fridays, but like what we've done in that week in the different teams. And I think that is great because it's like a 1 minute read and like you can totally tell what's going on in the company. So maybe explore something like that when you have a website project or an implementation to every week and like headlines of what has happened that week so people can be in the loop. Make time. This might sound like an oxymoron because I just focus all this presentation as like you don't have time, but with this I just mean like schedule small amounts of time to work on the project throughout the week. And with small amounts, I genuinely refer to like 30 minutes or even 15 minutes on Mondays and Fridays. It is better to schedule some time and be realistic about the amount of time that you have, that to just every week try to achieve like time that you don't have. As I say, like 30 minutes, it is enough. And it's just like a way to keep on top of things. It also helps you to know whether a week you're going to need more time. And then you can you can review your week and make that time. Also, if you're making time and you're putting it on your diary, make sure the time that you're allocating to work on the project and to quickly review things is respected by your work colleagues, because some people will try to schedule your meetings. So like make sure that as you're making time, you're also respecting the time that you've made. Prioritize. I love priorities. Of course, like that's why I end up like working in project management and implementation, because priorities are like my favorite thing in the world. If everything is important, nothing is. Some prioritization methodologies that I really like is the Moscow matrix. We work that quite heavily in Substrakt with projects to make sure that like everyone knows what is the important thing that we're going to be working. There is a link in the presentation and you're gonna get it. So like that explains what a Moscow matrix is. And then I really like the Eisenhower matrix. That is more for organizing your workload because it allows you to prioritize urgent versus important, and like it is really good. So I highly recommend to use a prioritization methodology. There are thousands of them out there. These are my two favorites and the ones that I use. But of course, like any prioritization is best than no prioritization. Define your role. I think Tony has touched on this, and also Darren. Like, it's very important to define what role you're going to have on the project, because a project has many roles. You can be the project manager, you can be the delivery manager, you can be a team leader, you can be a team member, you can be a product owner. Sometimes you can even be a sponsor. So it's very important for you to define your role, because, for instance, in Substrakt, I am a delivery manager. I just like look after the deliveries and make sure like the deadlines are respected. So like sometimes you need to look at the project, at the roles in the project, and decide which is the one that you're going to be doing. And that's important because it also make it achievable for you, what is like that you're going to be working on, and it's not overwhelming. It also means that then you can go inside your organization and ask other people to help you in the areas that you're not going to be working. I think Tony said it in his presentation, like no implementation and no project can be done by only one person. So just bear in mind that like you need to define your role and then tell everyone about it. Use the tools. So all of us use like different project management tools, and we always, every single time we start a project, we give you access to the tool. At Substrakt, we use Basecamp, other people use Trello, some people use Monday. I think the point here is like, familiarize yourself with the tools when you start a project. Make sure you understand them. As Darren said, like if you have questions, ask about how to use these tools. I love when people ask me how to use Basecamp. I have a full tutorial and I really like to go through it. And you know, it's just about like the tools are there to help, and if you are using them, it also means that probably your workload is going to be easier to manage because everything will be in one place. Also, make sure your team is using it, because tools usually are great to have everything in just one place, and you don't have to rely on Slack channels and emails or like any other communications that you have. Keep it simple. I really love this point. I think the most important thing in a project is always go back to that idea of like simplicity, and make sure that like what you're doing is achievable, that you can track it, you can measure it, and also it's specific and clear. Simplicity is key. This might sound a bit corny, but like two friends of mine were getting married, and like they were like having a massive argument about like how many people they needed to invite it to the wedding, and like they had a big list, and then they were like, okay, let's go back to basics, and who do we really need in that wedding? And they were like, well, we actually just need a priest or someone that will marry us, and the both of us, so a groom and a bride. And I think every single time I kind of like start going over complicated in a project, I go back to the idea like, okay, if this was a wedding, who is the groom, who's the bride, and where is like the person that is going to marry me? And that helps you to go to that idea of like keep it simple, and like think about also like an MVP, like what is the minimal that you need to achieve, because it's much better to do things well and to do less than try to do too much and end up like feeling frustrating and overwhelming, or like for the project to just go over budget or over time. That's not like the goal of a project, as Darren say. Like also we shouldn't be enjoying the project because we are doing amazing things. So yeah, always keep it simple. I think this links quite well with our communication, manage expectations. Of course, when you start an implementation or a new website project, you will have like a project manager that is like helping you with this in terms of like what is going to be delivered. But then you have to, it goes back to the idea of communicating internally. You need to make sure that internally you're managing the expectations and make sure like what is happening, when and how. I think the best key thing is like just be transparent about like how things are going. For me, like having open communication has been always the key. Allow yourself to fail. This sounds negative, but actually I think it's super important to make sure like that when you start a project, even every single time that I start a project, and I've been doing this for 10 years now, or even more, there is always going to be something that I'm going to make a mistake, or it's going to be a bit of a failure. And you know what? It's absolutely fine. It's not a problem. I think the important thing is like make the mistake, but like also learn fast from it so you won't make it again. And then like we do retrospectives internally to like make sure that we learn from our mistakes. But yeah, just when you start a project, especially if you're doing this on top of your day-to-day work, like allow yourself to have that moment when you just like things will go wrong. It's not going to be the end of the world. You have a project manager supporting you, you have a team, you have a full company supporting you. So like give yourself the possibility of failure. It is really important because it will help you how you feel about the project. Be prepared. So prepare yourself for a worst case scenario. I think one of the slides that Tony was showing, there was a mitigation plan. So like most of the time, well, not most of the time, every project manager you work with will always have a mitigation plan in case things don't go as planned. And you know, sometimes we don't want to hear about these things because we all want success, but actually the best thing we can do is like just be prepared for it. Because usually in order to be prepared, we will need to be able to prepare specific communications or have like a plan B in mind and a plan C, and everyone will need to know what they need to do in case the worst case scenario happen. So don't be afraid of preparing for the worst case scenario. It's actually quite good, and most of the times you will never have to use that preparation that you've done. But like being prepared means that you also will feel more in control when it happens, so you will be able to react faster than if you're not prepared. And then the last one is do the homework. So every project comes with homework. So with websites projects, it's always content. You always have a lot of content to do. Like make sure that you're keeping an eye on it. Make sure that like maybe in your project role, it doesn't mean that you are the one preparing the content, but you know, content is a massive bit of like a website project. So make sure like the people that is going to be working on the content knows it and are preparing for it. And then if you're doing a ticket implementation, is probably going to be the data check-in. So again, maybe you're not responsible or accountable for checking the data, but that's the homework that absolutely needs to happen. So make sure that like that homework gets done and that like everyone knows what's going to happen. And it goes back to the communication and like the expectations. Let everyone know when you're expecting them to have their homework done. So that was it. Thank you very much. I am willing to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. All three of you, actually, some great stuff. I've got quite a few notes here, actually. Q&A's open, folks, so anyone wants to get a question in for one, two, or all three of our project managers or project experts, please get in with your Q&A now. I got one to start off with, which is, it goes back to Monday's webinar, actually. We had George from After Digital, and he talked about a minimum viable product, which is a phrase lots of us have heard, you know, doing the bare minimum. What's the bare minimum acceptable versus the minimum lovable product? So, you know, what would be actually what our customers love, or what would be a project success? I just wonder how the three of you find when you start off a project, there's always big expectations, and is the scope the first thing to get rolled back, and the quality? Tony, do you want to start off on that one? What do you see slip first? Is it the quality? I mean, that's one of your first slides. Is it the quality, the speed, or the cost that goes first?
I would say that if the feedback and the communication is going well on the project, then yes, typically it would be identifying that, again, going back to those three corners, you know, either the resources or the time isn't available to fulfill that initial scope. And that's the thing that can get reviewed quite early on in projects, and I guess it ought to be reviewed, obviously, constantly throughout the project. But yes, typically quite early on an implementation, because, yeah, as you say, it's not unusual that everybody wants all singing, all dancing from day one, and that's often not a feasible proposition from day one. So there's definitely a need to manage expectations. I think certainly during the lead up to the kickoff meeting, but obviously once the implementation actually starts, that's all part of managing the expectations of the project.
Thanks, Tony. Darren, Elisa, what goes first? Is it quality, speed, or cost that slips first in that project triangle?
I think for me, it's the speed of things. I think Elisa mentioned that, you know, quite rightly so, that we've all got other jobs to do when we're in clients, and, you know, a lot of the time, though, you're expected to take these projects on at the same time as doing all those other jobs. So things like that can get in the way quite easily, and that could be from just missed meetings. It could be right the way through to actually they haven't progressed and got to the next part of the training or completed that training, so you can't move on to the next one. So for me, I think in my experience, it would be speed that goes first.
Yeah, so for me, I think is a speed, because when I always find that, like, when you kick off a project, you always have the excitement, so people are always happy for things to start happening quite fast. But then as the project keeps evolving, and then like you did the discovery and start like looking at the scope, the projects always tend to slow down. And also what I find is, like, sometimes when a project someone asks for a project, they underestimate the amount of time that is going to take that project to be delivered. And I find myself a lot of times after a big discovery, and even before scoping, having the conversation about, like, this is going to need all this time. Can you commit to that? If not, like, shall we start pushing back? And I personally don't think the success of a project comes like by the go live date and the delivery. Like, I think the go live date needs to be fluid, because I personally find that when you're trying to achieve something that is unrealistic, it ends up being like so frustrating, that for me, that's when a project is a big failure, when like the frustration is so big that no one is able to see the good sides of the project. And sometimes we have the tendency of like putting a go live date or like deciding when an end of a project happens without really looking at like the resources available and the time that we have and like the cost, because at the end of the day, like time is money. So yeah, it's, for me, it's probably speed as well.
Yeah, I think that's.
Go on, Tony.
I was just saying, I think that's a really interesting point. And Lisa did make the point about, you know, everybody has their day jobs, and typically at the start of an implementation, everybody does make a commitment to dedicate the time that they think they need to do to the project. But as the project progresses, they perhaps get a bit of a reality check and really come to realise, you know, the work that might be involved. But I would also say, and so that means that one of those three things needs to change. I would also say that specifically in the context of ticketing implementations, quite often they'll involve a clean cut-off and some sort of live order conversion. And often venues don't have too many windows during the course of the year when they have the opportunity to do that go lives, those transitions. So that does mean that if the go live date is fixed, then clearly the timeline is fixed, and under those circumstances, sometimes the scope of the project has to change to meet that deadline, because it is a pretty hard and fast deadline. But also, I would also make the point that the go live isn't the end of the project by any means, and clearly, you know, the go live could well be meeting that MVP that's agreed by all parties. But the bells and whistles, shall we say, the MLP comes after the go live, or can come after the go live if necessary.
Superb. Right, we need to dive into the Q&A because they're coming in. And as per usual, we don't go to the top one first, we go to the second one. So that's from Kenny McKinnon up there in Glasgow. And he hits on a subject that I had on my list to ask about tools. And Kenny asked, we recently tried to implement ClickUp as our project management tool. Good luck with that, Kenny, it's horrible. However, it didn't really get off the ground for various reasons. Do you have any tips on how to get the full team, some of whom may be a bit skeptical, to buy into project management systems when it hasn't worked with the team in the past? So how do you get people to buy in with Basecamp or anything else you're using?
I think I've. Oh,
sorry.
Sorry, it's Darren. I've seen this a few times where a lot of the time the people higher up the chain in organisations tend to be the ones who make that decision about which system they're going to take. And once you get through that, it's then the people in the relevant departments who then actually have to do the work. I think that was Tony mentioned that similar thing earlier on. So it's about bringing the whole team together and making some decisions as a team as soon as possible. Bring everybody with you on that journey. Don't just sort of pick them up halfway down the route. You know, it's getting that buy-in early, giving them some time to look at the different options, and talk to them and understand what it is they're skeptical about or that they're worried about. Sometimes it's a case of, you know, actually they're not two major problems and they're not insurmountable at all. A lot of it is change management and say taking people on that journey. If you can get through that, you'll be a lot better off in the longer run. Sorry, Elisa, you were going to mention as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love this question because this happens even like for us in the Substrakt team. We change tools and like it's always like how we get everyone to love the new tool and to use it. I completely agree with you. It's like a part of it is like bringing the team together in the decision, but also that has like a negative side that is like then decisions can take forever. So give deadlines and also know who's going to ultimately be the person making the decision. I also think about like, it is very important when you outline the advantages of like, you know, we're going to be working with it because it's going to bring these advantages and it's going to make our lives so much easier in this, and this. In my case, we recently changed not ticketing system, sorry, project management, internal project management tools. And one of the reasons was because like the feedback that we were getting from the team members was like constantly that it took them, there were too many tools and it took them too much time to move from one to another. So, you know, it's also thinking about like, we all highlight this problem, we're trying to solve it, and we think this is going to be what solves it. And then with change management, I also think like sometimes we forget about like spending time on like training people on the new process and the new tools. This is so important. Like I see this over and over again where people just assume you're just going to jump into a new tool and like, yes, know how it works, know everything. And like usually it's like the tool come with a process that you have put together. So make sure that you have training sessions with the team about how to use it, like write down the process and share it with everyone. Also write down the process, not as you think about it, but also about how someone that has never seen that tool will interact with it, and make time for reviews. That is like works really well when you say like, you know, in 6 months time we're all going to come together and review it and decide whether it's working or not. And like that also gives you a chance to understand who is more acceptable and like try to get them to like the tool, or like maybe they won't like it or love it, but they will tolerate it, which I sometimes think that's a win as well.
Tony, did you want to come in on that, or should we move on?
I'm not sure if I've got anything to add, really.
That's fine. That's fine.
I mean, I would say one specific thing I didn't mention is actually we used Trello quite extensively during our implementations, and I think one of the good things about it is I didn't mention it as part of the kickoff project, but meeting rather, but typically as part of the kickoff meeting, we will do an exercise that it ends up involving an awful lot of post-it notes, and Trello is really good in transferring those post-it notes into Trello. So I guess it's good to see the work that's done in that kickoff meeting being translated into the project tool that's then going to be used as the project moves along.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Trello. I like the way it works, very visual. And I think a lot of doing projects in, especially performing arts or creative settings, you know, it's very important to have a system that's aesthetically pleasing and,
Yep.
you know, very visual. And I know, so I'm not a big fan of Monday.com, but, you know, kind of like Asana and Trello, which are not traditionally project management tools per se, but offer some really nice interfaces and a nice place to work. Okay, next up, keeping an eye on time, Billy's top of the pile. And Billy asks, is it always necessary to have completed recognized project management training to be able to successfully deliver a brackets big project? Or do you think it's possible to do without? Who wants to dive in that with that one first?
I can start. I think it depends. I don't think that it depends on like what side of the project you are. Like if you want to be a project manager for a vendor, yes, absolutely. But if you are in a part of an organization and you're starting a project, I think there's enough literature online and things that you can do for free that are not recognized that can help you. And you don't need to have completed any training. A lot of it is like then let the project manager at the other end guide you and ask the questions and be open about like where you are not that sure about things. It depends a lot of the role that you're expecting to have in that project.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I guess it depends on what's meant by big, but certainly from the members' point of view during the implementation, we wouldn't necessarily expect. I would say it's quite unusual for the lead project manager on an implementation from the members' side to have formal project management experience. But that's also part of the responsibility of our project manager is to. I mean, we would obviously expect that the project manager that's appointed has been identified as somebody with the necessary skills and abilities, and also, I guess, authority throughout the organisation, not necessarily formal authority, but it's respected throughout the organisation to lead that project. But then it would be the role of our project manager to maybe help them with the finer details of how the technical aspects of how project management works.
Yes, I completely agree with that as well. I don't think there's specific training that's needed. A lot of this process is really about common sense. And as I alluded to in my presentation, it was about things like terminology can help that process. There's no point in having a project manager from either side who doesn't understand what the actual goal is. So all of these things start to pull together again. That said, lifelong learning, I constantly look at sites and try and find different ways of approaching things. So it shouldn't just stop just because you haven't got a qualification or training. It doesn't mean to say that there aren't resources out there that you can tap into as and when you need to, and just put a different spin on things maybe. But yeah, it's I don't think it's absolutely essential for that to happen.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions left, one of which is actually aimed at Tony. So what I'm going to do is have these 3 questions to keep this on time, like every project manager likes to be. So first off, to Tony, you mentioned that sometimes project scope needs revisiting in order to keep into timelines and or budget. How do you recommend folks approach this conversation? Often people get very, very attached to the list of requirements and quote must have. So how do we start that conversation, Tony?
Well, that rings some bells with me, I must admit. But I guess it's part of the retiring risk early is part of that conversation. So it's identifying that risk, hopefully before it arises. So I talked earlier on about identifying risks at the kickoff of a project, but also as it should also inform part of the regular reporting that's going back to the executive sponsor of an implementation, is that the project is falling behind schedule. We may at some point in the future need to look at rescoping the project, so that when that discussion happens, one would hope that it's not to come as a surprise. It shouldn't come completely out of left field. If the reporting and the communication has been going well, it should be identified as something that has become a possibility over the preceding weeks. And then I guess it would then form part of the conversation with the project team as a whole in the member organisation. And they would then make recommendations amongst themselves about what has to go and what needs to be kept in order to meet that MVP and the timeline.
Superb, thanks for that, Tony.
But having said that, yes, sometimes it does come down to hard decisions, and having a word with the executive sponsor and making it clear to them that they need to make the decision and give the hard word to somebody within the organisation that it's not going to happen for go live.
Superb, superb. Elisa, one for you. Any tips for putting together a project proposal for higher ups? What are the key points to focus on that can be translated easily?
I guess make it really clear what is the purpose of the project and what is that you're trying to achieve with that project, and also the amount of time that you have for it. I think that will be the most important thing. Like, what is it? And probably also talk about like success when you look, like when you're thinking about like putting together a project proposal, and like what is the end result, like what would be like the success of the project, but always making sure about that you're clear about like what is that the project is going to achieve and the time that you have and the resources. Any project proposal that doesn't take into account the resources and the time that you will have, and not the time in terms of like just having a timeline on a Gantt chart, like realistically thinking, we want to make this project, and to have this project we need 6 months of like everyone dedicating full time for it. Can we do that? No. Then how much time do we have? and how we have to increase the timeline or sometimes even decrease it. I think that's really important to give context of that project. I don't know if this answered the question, to be honest. I hope it did.
I think it did. I think it did. So that's good. Right, last one for Darren, because I know you've been doing a lot of this, and it's very relevant to where we are now. And we have 30 seconds to bring this project in on time. Do you have any recommendations on how to successfully start or keep a project going while everyone is working remotely?
Really interesting, and I don't actually think this is key to just the situation we're in at the moment. I've tried to implement this throughout all things. Don't make if you're doing it remotely and having Zoom meetings and things like that, don't make them too long. Don't go and put a 2.5 hour session in. They just don't work. People tend to switch off. It's very difficult for the trainer to keep that momentum going and keeping it interesting for you at that time. So when I do those things, I typically go for no more than 1 hour. And even with that, there's probably at least a couple of minutes break in between there just to refocus if need be. I have, however, done other things where we've done like a morning session, so an hour in the morning, set some little homework for a break for 2 or 3 hours, and then revisit it back for a half an hour backup session later in the afternoon, just to answer any questions that may have arisen. Arguably, yeah,
Can I jump in and say something quickly?
Of course you can.
Promise I'll be quick. Well, you may not know, but Tessitura is a virtual company. We all work from home anywhere, all 200 plus staff, all working from home. So, as I've done for the last 14 years. So, in that respect, what's happened over the last 10 weeks or so hasn't been too much of a transition work-wise. One thing that we found, we introduced maybe a year or so ago for remote meetings. I know we haven't in this meeting, but using webcams, it's really good that you can see the whites of people's eyes when they're talking. And I know it's not quite the same as being in the room, but it does help an awful lot.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely.
Well, there we are. We're bang on an hour. Look at that. The project managers brought it home on time. Well done, all three of you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, folks, for joining. Hopefully some tips there at Test Network, at Yesplan, at Substrakt. I've seen some social activity during this webinar of links and bits and pieces going on to you. And this webinar and resources will be online on the TPC website after we finish today. Thank you very much, all three of you. Superb effort putting that together. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you.
And thank you all for attending, and hopefully we will see you for tomorrow's season finale, if not in Birmingham next year. Good afternoon.
All right, thank you. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.